June Calder was on her knees scrubbing a stranger's bathroom, 20 years old with $26 in her checking account and 2 months of back rent against her name, when the phone in her back pocket started buzzing with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go. Nobody with real news called numbers like hers. The man on the line introduced himself as Arthur Denny, a lawyer who handled a trust out of the county courthouse. His voice had the particular patience of someone who made calls like this often and had learned not to let a long silence on the other end rush him. After a few sentences she barely followed, about a great-aunt she had never heard of named Opal Whitfield, he told her the thing that mattered. There was an orchard, 6 acres of it, an old motor court standing beside it, and a trust that was supposed to release everything to her 2 years ago, on the morning she turned 18. It hadn't. 2 years ago. Her stomach folded the way it always did when that birthday came up, which she had learned over time to avoid entirely. Her mother had died on a Tuesday in March after 8 months of a cancer that had taken its time about it. Roy, her stepfather, had been managing her mother's affairs for years by then, paying the bills, dealing with the bank, and it made a certain fogged sense that week that he would keep managing things a little longer. 9 days later, on the morning June turned 18, he set a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table and slid it toward her. Just a formality, he said, getting the estate squared away before the lawyers start billing us for it. She signed it without reading past the first line because her hand had to move for something when the rest of her had stopped moving at all. By the end of that same week, the locks were changed. A suitcase waited on the porch, packed with more care than she expected from him. A winter coat 2 sizes too large, a hairdryer that never once had been hers, not a single photograph. That was the moment Roy told her the only true thing he had ever said to her in his life. "You're 18 now. Time to be on your own." 2 years without a fixed address had taught her which shelters kept curfews and which diners let a person nurse a coffee for 3 hours. She waited tables, she stocked shelves, she cleaned buildings same as this one, for landlords who took the work off whatever she owed instead of paying cash, which was its own kind of arrangement when a person had nowhere else to be. She hadn't cried in front of him. Her mother had taught her that, in the last bad months, hands gone papery and cold no matter how many blankets they piled on. Some things you don't hand to people who won't hold them right. He must have booked the locksmith before she'd even finished signing. The timing was too clean to be anything but planned. Her mother had said one more thing near the end that June filed away without understanding. Something about an orchard from before any of them that her own grandmother had kept. "I never got to see it," her mother said. "Maybe you will." She hadn't thought about that sentence in 2 years. She thought about it now, sitting on a wet floor with a stranger's voice in her ear, the way a person thinks about a door they must have walked past 100 times without ever once trying the handle. Denny, still on the line, was explaining why the trust had sat frozen all that time. There was a document in the file, he said, dated the same week as the funeral. Her signature was on it. June's fingers went cold around the phone. "What document?" "It's a renunciation. You gave up a beneficial interest in an estate you were never told existed." The bucket of soapy water sat forgotten beside her knee. Outside, a truck downshifted on the highway, and the sound stretched out longer than it should have. "Somebody needs to explain that to me," June said, slowly. "That's why I'm calling. There's a letter in the file and an inventory list of the property I honestly don't know how to describe over the phone. There's also something the caretaker mentioned. A mule that walks to the same tree every evening and stands there for hours. He's never been able to explain it. Neither can I." June looked down at her hands, raw-knuckled from the job she'd start again at 6 that evening. Still, underneath the cracked skin, something in them had gone very still. "I can be there Thursday," she said. "There's one more thing." A pause, the kind that meant the next sentence had been rehearsed. "There's a structure on the property that's been sealed since before you were born. Nobody on record has set foot inside it in over 20 years. "Sealed how?" she said. "That," said Arthur Denny, "is the part I think you need to see for yourself." June sat there a long moment, knees numb against the wet tile, the mop leaning untouched against the wall. 20 years old, 2 months behind a room she cleaned for someone else, and somewhere 4 hours north, a door nobody had touched in longer than she had been alive, and a mule keeping watch over a tree with no name. She had exactly one thing left that nobody had ever managed to take from her. She was still curious. She gave her landlord 2 days' notice she didn't legally owe him, borrowed bus fare from a coworker who didn't ask why, and told no one else because there was no one else left. She was on a bus by Wednesday morning. The bus ride took 4 hours, and somewhere around the second hour, June stopped rehearsing what she would say when she got there. There was nothing to rehearse. She had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. She watched the highway narrow from 4 lanes to 2, and thought about her mother's cryptic sentence again, the one she had carried for 2 years without unpacking it, an orchard from before any of them. Arthur Denny met her at the county courthouse first. He was a small man in a gray suit who talked fast, apologized twice for his rushed pace, and handed her a manila folder thick enough to require both hands. He didn't offer to drive her to the property himself. That, he explained, checking his watch, was Earl's territory now. Earl Whitfield was waiting by a rusted iron gate when June's taxi pulled up the last quarter-mile of gravel. He was somewhere past 70, built like a fence post, and watched her step out of the car with an expression that held zero surprise. "You'll be June," he said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Same jawline as your grandmother's people. Bad news if you were hoping to blend in around here." He didn't offer a handshake. He just turned and started walking. June quickly realized this was the tour, and it had already begun, because Earl didn't seem like a man who wasted daylight on pleasantries. The orchard opened up past the gate like a heavy, released breath. Rows of ancient trees, their bark gone silver-gray and split with age, stretched back farther than June could see in the fading light. The air smelled of turned earth and something sweeter underneath it, the ghost of windfall apples rotting softly into the soil. Beside the trail, half hidden in tall weeds, stood a low row of connected buildings. The old motor court. 6 doors in a line, the paint weathered to the color of driftwood. June's eyes tracked across them. Doors 1 through 5 were simply shut. But door number 6 was different. June slowed to a halt, a sudden cold weight dropping into her stomach. Heavy wooden boards were nailed across the doorframe in a rough X. Where a handle should have been, there was instead a scatter of iron nail heads driven flush into the wood decades ago. Thick streaks of orange rust bled down the peeling paint from each nail, looking uncomfortably like dried blood. It didn't look like a room closed for repairs. It looked like a tomb. Something clicked into place in June's chest before she could stop it. This was it, the thing Denny had mentioned over the phone 2 days ago and refused to explain. Sealed since before she was born, nobody on record inside in over 20 years. Sealed how, she'd asked. That's the part I think you need to see for yourself, he'd said. Hearing about a locked door from 4 hours away and standing in front of the actual splintered wood, the actual rust, were 2 entirely different things. "What happened to that one?" she asked, her voice dropping a register. Earl didn't quite look at it. Wasn't here 20 years ago, and it wasn't going anywhere 20 years ago. Some things you just work around long enough, you forget to ask. June didn't forget to ask. A deep, unsettling chill crept up her spine, but beneath the fear, a stubborn spark of curiosity ignited. Someone had wanted whatever was in that room to never see the sun again. Earl kept walking, and June forced herself to follow. At the base of the nearest apple tree, a small brass plate was nailed into the bark, oxidized to a deep, bruised green. June crouched to read it. A name, a year. She recognized neither. "Every tree's got one," Earl said, not turning around. 44 of them, if you count right. I have. What do they mean? That's a longer conversation than we've got daylight for. Earl looked toward the western ridge. Opal said there'd be a day the right person showed up. Took a lot longer than she liked to admit, but I believe she was right. June looked down at the brass tag again. Beneath the name, there was a small mark scratched into the corner. It wasn't random damage. It was a deliberate, strange shape, worn smooth with the weather. Before she could ask about it, the last of the sunlight dipped behind the ridge, and a new sound broke the silence. A slow, heavy footstep in the tall grass behind them. June turned. An old mule, gray around the muzzle, walked out from the shadows of the motor court. It moved with the eerie mechanical certainty of something repeating a heavily worn loop. The animal didn't glance at June or Earl. It walked directly to a single isolated tree at the far edge of the orchard, one with no brass plate on its bark, and stopped. It lowered its head and simply stood there, utterly motionless, facing the trunk the way a mourning person stands at a grave. June's chest tightened. Denny had mentioned this over the phone, and in the bright fluorescent light of the laundromat, she had pictured something abstract, maybe even a little absurd. But seeing it now, in the creeping dark, there was nothing funny about it. It was profoundly disturbing. The animal wasn't grazing. It wasn't resting. It was keeping a vigil. June took a half step back, a shiver running down her arms. She had no desire to reach out and touch it. "That's Rosie," Earl said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Does that every evening. Has for as long as I've been here." "Why?" "Wish I could tell you. Some things on this land I stopped asking why a long time ago. I'll just make sure they still happen." Earl turned toward the first unit of the motor court, the one farthest from the boarded-up door. A key was already in the lock. He told her she could sleep there tonight, and that they would talk about the reality of the property tomorrow. Then he left her alone in the fading light. June didn't linger outside. The silence of the orchard was too loud, and the silhouette of the mule in the distance made her skin crawl. She went inside, shut the door, and locked it. The room smelled of old dust and cedar. Sitting on the edge of a narrow, unfamiliar bed, her hands trembling slightly, she finally opened the thick folder Denny had given her. Past the copy of the renunciation, the paper he had tricked her into signing, she found it. A plain, sealed envelope with her name written in careful, deliberate handwriting. She tore it open. The letter was short. "If you are reading this, it means the trust did exactly what I asked it to do, and you are old enough now that no one can talk you out of what is yours. I won't explain everything here. Some things explain themselves better once you are standing in the middle of them. Earl will look after you if you let him. The mule will not. She only looks after herself, and whatever she has decided is worth looking after. I was young once too, and someone did something for me I never got the chance to thank properly. This orchard is what I did instead. Opal." June read it twice, then a third time. And somewhere in that quiet room, her mother's voice surfaced in her memory, crystal clear. "I never got to see it. Maybe you will." She folded the letter carefully. Outside, a chill wind rattled the window pane, but the tightness in June's chest had shifted. The fear was still there, sharp and cold, but it was now anchored by something else. She looked toward the wall, in the exact direction where door number 6 sat nailed shut in the dark. Opal hadn't left her a farm. She had left her a puzzle. And for the first time in 2 years, June had a reason to wake up the next morning. June walked over to her duffel bag. Tucked in the front pocket was a manila envelope. Denny had handed it to her at the courthouse, forwarding it from his office. The return address belonged to a law firm in her hometown, Roy's Lawyers. She tore the flap open. A cashier's check for $5,000 fluttered onto the bed. It was attached to a formal letter, heavy with legal jargon, explaining that while the orchard was functionally worthless and requiring demolition, her stepfather, out of the goodness of his heart, was offering a nuisance settlement to finalize the paperwork she had signed 2 years ago. June sat on the edge of the bed, the check trembling slightly in her hand. $5,000. It would clear her back rent. It would buy hot meals for months. It would buy her a ticket as far away from door number 6 and that motionless mule as a bus could take her. She stared at the numbers. Then she thought about Roy. Roy, who had measured the cost of the electricity she used as a teenager. Roy, who had changed the locks 9 days after her mother's funeral to avoid paying for an extra week of groceries. Roy didn't give away money. He invested it. If a man like that was willing to hand her $5,000 to walk away from a worthless property, what was it actually worth? 50,000? $500,000? He wasn't paying for her signature. He was paying for her absence. He was terrified of what she might find if she stayed. June looked toward the window, out at the overgrown trees and the heavy morning mist. The dread in her stomach hadn't left, but now it was sharing space with something colder, a sharp, undeniable anger. She didn't know what was behind the sealed door. She didn't know the market value of 6 acres of dead apple trees, but she knew she wasn't going to let Roy steal it twice. With deliberate slowness, she tore the check in half. She put the pieces together and tore them again, dropping the confetti into the wastebasket. She walked outside. The morning air was biting. She bypassed the 6th unit entirely. She still wasn't ready to face whatever was behind those iron nails. Instead, she marched out to the nearest row of ancient apple trees. She rolled up her sleeves, gripped a massive tangle of dead, thorny vines wrapping the base of the closest trunk, and pulled. Within 10 minutes, the briars had bitten through her unfamiliar skin. Her palms stung. Bright lines of blood welled up across her knuckles, but she kept pulling. The physical pain was grounding. It was a barrier she understood how to fight, unlike the silent, suffocating mysteries of this place. "Wondering if you can clear 6 acres by bleeding on them," a voice said behind her. Earl Whitfield stood there, holding a thermos of coffee. He didn't offer to help, and he didn't tell her to stop. "Grafting is the reason these trees are worth what they're worth," he said quietly, nodding at the brass tag she had just uncovered from the weeds. June wiped her forehead with the back of a dirty wrist, leaving a streak of soil across her skin. She waited. "You don't grow a tree like this from seed," Earl continued, stepping closer to trace a thick, scarred knot on the trunk. "Seed gives you a stranger. Might be good, might be nothing at all, since every apple carries 2 parents' worth of genetic surprises in it." He looked at her, his weathered face dead serious in the morning light. "If you want the exact same fruit your grandmother grew, the exact same sweetness, the same skin, you can't plant a seed. You take a live piece of her actual tree, a dormant bud. You cut it and you graft it onto a completely different root system. Earl patted the scarred wood. The roots below ground don't change what grows above them. They just carry the water up. It's the same fruit, just borrowed legs to stand on. He poured her a cup of coffee and set it on a nearby stump. Opal used to tell me that all the time. She said, grafted, not grown. That's the only kind of family worth keeping. June looked down at her own hands. Dirt was already working its way into the fresh cuts on her knuckles. She felt something shift deep in her chest. She had been severed from her past when Roy threw her out. She had been surviving without roots for 2 years. Grafted, not grown. The words hit her and anchored her to the ground she was standing on. By midday, the sun was blistering. June went into a dusty, leaning shed near the edge of the property to find a pair of work gloves. The air inside smelled of motor oil and dry rot. Sitting on a warped wooden workbench, half buried under a pile of rusted shears, was a spiral notebook. The cover was soft with years of handling. June opened it, driven by the restless energy that had fueled her all morning. It was Earl's handwriting. It was a mundane log of weather patterns, watering schedules, and soil treatments. But halfway through the book, a single entry, dated almost 15 years ago, made her stop breathing. Miss Opal came back late again tonight, hands full of dirt. Didn't say where from. June read the 2 sentences over and over. The air in the shed suddenly felt heavy. Why would a wealthy old woman be sneaking back in the dead of night, her hands covered in dirt? June thought about the 44 names on the brass plates. She thought about the strange mark scratched into the tags, and she thought about the door with the iron nails. She closed the notebook, putting it back exactly where she found it. That night, the silence of the motor court was deafening. June sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the rotary phone from the front office resting on her lap. She dialed a number from memory, one of the only connections to her old life she hadn't let go of. A distant cousin on her mother's side, the only piece of her maternal family Roy hadn't managed to alienate. When the elderly woman finally answered, June didn't waste time on pleasantries. She asked carefully if anyone in the family had ever mentioned the name Opal Whitfield. Her cousin hesitated. The name itself didn't ring a bell. But then, almost as an afterthought, the old woman offered a piece of history. Your great-grandmother had an orchard in a different county, long before my time. The bank took it when things got bad. I never got to see it myself. I think your mother mentioned it once, years ago. June's breath caught in her throat, her grip the plastic receiver, her knuckles turning white. I never got to see it, her mother had said near the end, her hands paper-thin and freezing no matter how many blankets they piled on. Maybe you will. June had filed that sentence away as the rambling of a dying woman. Now, sitting in the dark, the words hit her with the force of a physical blow. The puzzle Opal left behind didn't just belong to a stranger, it belonged to her mother. It was an inherited grief, a stolen legacy that had somehow, impossibly, found its way back into June's bleeding hands. She hung up the phone. Outside, a slow, rhythmic sound drifted through the window. Hooves in the tall grass, Rosie settling in for her evening vigil under the nameless tree. The fear hadn't entirely left June, but the anger and the need for answers had finally eclipsed it. She wasn't running. Tomorrow, she was going to find out whose name was on the first brass tag. The first brass tag belonged to a woman named Martha Hayes. The year stamped beneath it was 1992. June found the tree at the edge of the second row. It was a sturdy, sprawling thing, heavy with green leaves that rustled in the morning breeze. She knelt in the damp grass, rubbing her thumb over the oxidized copper. Martha Hayes, 1992. She didn't know the name, but she knew what she had to do. "You want to take a piece of it?" Earl said. He was standing behind her, holding a grafting knife and a roll of waxy green tape. "You have to do it right. You don't just hack a branch off and hope for the best. You have to marry them." He led her to a small workbench he had set up near the shed. On it sat a dozen young rootstock saplings in black plastic pots. "Whip and tongue graft," Earl explained. He handed her the knife. The blade was short, curved, and razor-sharp. "You make a long, sloping cut on the rootstock. Then you make the exact same cut on the piece you took from Opal's tree, the scion. Then you cut a small tongue into both faces. They interlock, like puzzle pieces." He demonstrated with 2 dead twigs. It looked effortless. It wasn't. June took the knife. Her hands were still sore from pulling briars the day before. She took a deep breath, angled the blade against a fresh piece of scion wood, and pushed. The knife slipped. It sliced past the wood and bit shallowly into her left thumb. June hissed, dropping the blade. A bright bead of blood welled up. "Too much wrist," Earl said. He didn't offer a bandage. "Use your shoulder. Try again." She wiped the blood on her jeans. She picked up the knife. She tried again. The second cut was jagged. The angles didn't match. When she tried to push the 2 pieces of wood together, they slipped apart. A failed graft. If she planted this, it would die. "The green layers just under the bark, the cambium, they have to touch. If the scars don't touch, they can't heal together. They can't share water. Try again." June took a 3rd piece of wood. She ignored the stinging in her thumb. She focused entirely on the angle of the blade, the resistance of the living wood. She pulled through with her shoulder, a clean, sloping cut. She made the notch for the tongue. She picked up the rootstock. She lined them up. She pushed them together. Click. The 2 pieces of wood interlocked perfectly. The green edges met, flush and tight. They looked like a single wounded branch that had suddenly decided to be whole. "Wrap it tight," he said softly. "Keep the air out. The tree will do the rest of the work." 2 hours later, June was driving Earl's beat-up Ford pickup truck down the mountain. Wrapped in damp burlap on the passenger seat was the freshly grafted sapling. Finding Martha Hayes hadn't required a private investigator. It had only required an hour at the county library, looking through old property tax records and a local phone book. Martha still lived in the county, in a modest single-story house on the outskirts of a town 20 miles away. June pulled into the driveway. The house was neat but tired. The paint was peeling around the window frames, and the steps sagged slightly under her boots. She knocked. A minute passed, then the door opened. An elderly woman stood behind the screen door, wearing a faded floral cardigan. Her hair was stark white, and her eyes held the guarded caution of someone used to turning away salesmen. "Can I help you?" asked June. "I am." June looked down at the damp burlap bundle in her arms. Suddenly, the speech she had practiced in the truck felt incredibly fragile. "My name is June Calder. I'm Opal Whitfield's great-niece." Martha blinked. The caution in her eyes shifted into something else, something like shock. She unlocked a screen door and pushed it open. "Opal?" Martha's voice trembled slightly. "Opal passed away?" "I know," June said gently. "I inherited her orchard. I found your name on one of the trees. The tag said 1992. Martha stared at her. The color seemed to drain from her face. She reached out and gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "1992," Martha whispered. "That was the year the bank took our farm. My husband got sick. We couldn't make the payments. We lost the house. We lost the land. We lost the heritage apple trees my grandfather planted, the ones we were so proud of. I thought they were gone forever." June stepped forward. She held out the bundle of damp burlap. "They're not," June said. Martha looked down at the sapling. "Before you lost the farm, Opal must have taken a cutting. She grafted it in her orchard. She kept it alive for 30 years. This morning, I took a piece of that tree. I grafted it onto new roots. It's the exact same fruit, Mrs. Hayes. It's your grandfather's tree." Martha Hayes didn't say a word. She reached out with trembling, arthritis-gnarled hands and took the sapling. She pulled the damp dirt and wood against her chest, right against her faded cardigan, closing her eyes. She wept. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was the deep, shuddering sob of a woman holding a piece of her history she thought had been erased from the earth. June stood on the sagging porch, the mountain wind pulling at her hair. She watched a stranger cry over a wounded branch wrapped in wax tape. And in that moment, the final lingering doubt in June's mind evaporated. Opal hadn't been a crazy old woman digging in the dirt at midnight. Opal had been building a sanctuary, an archive of stolen legacies. When June finally got back into the truck, the sun was beginning to dip behind the western ridge. The drive back up the mountain felt different. The cracked asphalt, the rusting fences, the dense tunnels of oak and hickory, none of it looked abandoned anymore. It looked like it was waiting. She pulled into the gravel lot of the motor court. The air was cooling, smelling of pine and damp earth. Across the grass, Rosie was already standing under the nameless tree, keeping her silent, motionless vigil. June didn't feel the urge to run from the sight of the mule this time. She parked the truck and leaned against the steering wheel, looking out over the 6 acres of ancient, grafted trees. She had returned one legacy today. There were 43 brass tags left, 43 families who had lost something, carefully preserved by an old woman who refused to let them be forgotten. It would take years to find them all. It would take more money than she had, and more patience than she knew she possessed. June turned off the ignition, pulled the keys from the dash, and smiled in the dark. She had exactly enough time. Word got around. Mountain News always did. A month after Martha Hayes wept on her front porch, a man in a tweed jacket parked a dusty Subaru by the motor court. Dr. Aris, a botanical researcher from the State University. He didn't want gas, he wanted an apple. June walked him into the orchard. She picked a fruit from the oldest row and handed it to him. It wasn't supermarket perfect. The skin was rough, asymmetrical, and bruised with a deep oxidized red. Dr. Aris wiped it on his sleeve and took a bite. The snap was loud in the quiet orchard. He closed his eyes. "Arkansas Black," he murmured, "or maybe an original wine sap strain." He looked at June, his face flushed with genuine excitement. Supermarket apples are bred for transport, thick skin, sugar water, zero complex flavor. But this is living history. High-end cider breweries and culinary chefs pay a premium for this exact tartness. It's impossible to find. He looked down the endless rows of silver-barked trees. "You aren't just sitting on a sanctuary, Miss Calder. You are sitting on a commercial gold mine." A gold mine. The word hung in the air long after the researcher drove away. June looked at her dirt-stained hands. She hadn't thought about the money. She had only thought about the 44 families. But someone else had definitely thought about the money. That afternoon, the gravel crunched under much heavier, much more expensive tires. A silver Mercedes SUV pulled into the lot. June froze. The pruning shears suddenly felt very heavy in her hand. Her chest turned to ice. Roy. He stepped out of the driver's side. 60 years old, tailored slocks, leather loafers stepping carefully over the dirt. He looked exactly the same as the day he had handed her a suitcase and locked her out. He looked like a man who owned the world. He took off his sunglasses. He surveyed the trees, the motor court, and finally, June. "You're looking well?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "Dirt suits you. Why are you here, Roy?" "I tore up a very generous check." "I tore up a bribe," June said, her voice dropping to a cold, flat register. "There's a difference." Roy dropped the polite smile. The mask slipped, revealing the calculating businessman underneath. "You think you're clever?" he said, walking slowly toward her. "You think you can just walk into a multi-million-dollar commercial asset because some senile aunt left a trust? You're a 20-year-old girl playing farmer." June didn't step back. She held her ground. "Get off my property." "It's not your property," Roy snapped. "Your mother was sick for a long time, June. I paid the medical bills. I managed the estate. When you signed that paper 2 years ago, you were a grieving dependent. I was your legal guardian during that transition." He stopped 5 feet away. "I invested heavily in your mother's care. This estate owes me a massive debt. You don't get to run off with an unappraised agricultural asset just because the clock ran out on the trust. You didn't care about this land 2 years ago. You only care now because the trust unfroze and you realized you couldn't steal it quietly." Roy put his sunglasses back on. "We'll let a judge decide what's fair," he said softly. "Enjoy the fresh air while you can." He got back in his SUV. He didn't look back. The silver car disappeared down the mountain road, leaving a cloud of choking dust in its wake. That evening, the air was thick. The threat hung over the orchard like a physical weight. June stood on the porch of the motor court, gripping a mug of black coffee. Earl stood beside her in the gathering dark. Across the grass, a slow, rhythmic sound broke the silence. Hooves. Rosie. The old mule walked to the edge of the orchard. She stopped under the nameless tree. She lowered her head and went perfectly, terrifyingly still. "Heard you had a visitor today," Earl said, not looking away from the mule. "He wants the land. He's going to use my mother's medical bills to claim I owe him." Earl took a slow sip of his coffee. "People always want what isn't theirs." He pointed a calloused finger toward the darkness, toward Rosie. "You ever wonder why Opal trained that mule to stand right there?" June frowned, turning to look at the old man. "Trained?" "Mules don't hold vigils for fun, June. They're working animals. They do what they're taught." Earl's voice dropped to a low, gravelly whisper. "Opal put her there for a reason. Maybe she's guarding something Opal didn't want anyone digging up, not until the right time." A cold shiver raced down June's spine. She looked back at the motionless animal, standing like a sentinel over an unmarked grave. 3 days later, the mail carrier dropped a thick, certified envelope into the rusted mailbox on Route 11. It wasn't a $5,000 check. It was an official summons from the county court. Roy had filed a motion to seize the Whitfield Trust. The sanctuary was under attack. The court summons sat on the counter right next to Earl's reading glasses. 30 days, that was all the time June had before a judge would hear Roy's motion to seize the trust. 30 days to prove Opal's orchard wasn't just a piece of commercial real estate waiting to be liquidated by a greedy stepfather. June didn't panic. The cold, sharp anger that had ignited when she tore up Roy's check now crystallized into absolute focus. She looked out the window at the 6th unit of the motor court, the heavy boards, the iron nails, the rust. Whatever Opal was hiding in there, Roy couldn't have it. June grabbed a notepad, a flashlight, and a crowbar from the repair bay. She marched out to the orchard. She spent the next 3 days doing nothing but documenting the trees. She went row by row, copying down the name, the year, and the exact shape of the deliberate scratch on every single brass tag. By the time she finished, she had 44 distinct symbols. It wasn't random damage. It wasn't just a maker's mark. It was a sequence. The scratches were variations of lines and dots, subtly corresponding to the tree's position in the orchard grid. Row 3, tree 7. Row 1, tree 12. A mapping system. But mapping to what? On the evening of the 4th day, the sun dropped behind the western ridge. June stood on the porch, exhausted, her hands blistering again. Across the wet grass, Rosie walked out of the shadows. The old mule took her position under the nameless tree at the edge of the property, lowering her head in her silent, terrifying vigil. Opal put her there for a reason, Earl had told her. Maybe she's guarding something Opal didn't want anyone digging up. June's heart kicked against her ribs. She grabbed a heavy iron trowel from the shed and walked out to the nameless tree. Rosie didn't move. The mule only watched with calm, cloudy eyes as June dropped to her knees in the dirt. Right exactly where the mule always stood, the earth was unusually flat. June dug. 4 inches down, the trowel scraped against something hard. Not a root, not a rock. June tossed the trowel aside and used her bare hands, clawing the damp soil away. It was a flat piece of slate. June pried it up. Beneath it lay a heavy, rusted metal lockbox. June pulled it out of the ground. It was locked with a heavy brass padlock, but this lock didn't take a key. It was a combination lock, featuring 4 rotating dials, not numbers, symbols, lines, and dots, the exact same symbols carved on the 44 brass tags. June stared at the 4 rusted dials. Her heart sank. 44 symbols, 4 dials, millions of possible combinations. If she guessed wrong, or if the rusted internal mechanism jammed from too much force, she would never get it open. She raced back to her room, carrying the heavy box. She laid it on the floor next to the pages of notes she had painstakingly copied. She stared at her hand-drawn grid. Row 3, tree 7, Hayes, 1992. Row 1, tree 12, Miller, 1988. Her eyes drifted over her notes again. And then she saw it. An anomaly in her own data. Out of the 44 tags she had documented, 40 of them followed the exact same pattern: name, year, symbol. But 4 of the entries on her notepad were incomplete. The 4 massive, ancient trees standing at the outermost corners of the orchard. When June had checked their tags, there were no names, no years, just the carved symbols. Earl's voice echoed in her memory. The roots below ground don't change what grows above them, just borrowed legs to stand on. Opal didn't plant those 4 trees. They were the original rootstock, the ancient foundation she had bought 40 years ago to support the entire sanctuary. The roots of the orchard. 4 foundation trees, 4 dials on the lock. June's hands were shaking. She grabbed the lockbox. She looked at her map, moving clockwise from the northern corner tree. She spun the first rusted dial to match its symbol. Click. She moved to the eastern corner tree. Click. The southern tree. Click. The western tree. She spun the final dial into place. She held her breath and pulled. The shackle snapped open. Inside the box was a single, heavy iron key. It was wrapped in oiled cloth to prevent rust. Attached to it was a small metal tag. It read, Unit 6. June didn't wait for morning. She took the crowbar, the flashlight, and the iron key and walked directly to the boarded-up door. The fear that had kept her away for a month was completely gone, burned away by the ticking clock of Roy's lawsuit. She jammed the crowbar behind the heavy wooden X and threw her weight into it. The rusted nails screamed as they pulled free from the wood. She tore the boards away, letting them clatter onto the concrete. Behind the boards, hidden from view for over 2 decades, was a heavy deadbolt. June inserted the iron key. It resisted for a second, then turned with a heavy, satisfying clank. She pushed the door open. The air inside was trapped, dry and cold. It smelled strongly of beeswax, dried herbs, and old paper. June flicked on the flashlight and swept the beam across the darkness. She had expected a tomb. She found an archive. Floor-to-ceiling wooden shelving lined all 4 walls of the motel room. The bed and furniture had been completely removed. Sitting on the shelves, meticulously organized, were dozens of heavy glass mason jars. June walked inside, her breath pluming in the cold air. She picked up the nearest jar. The top was heavily sealed with thick, hardened beeswax to make it perfectly airtight. Inside the jar were several short, dormant twigs resting on a bed of dry moss. Scion wood. Opal hadn't just grafted the trees in the orchard. She had preserved the dormant cuttings in airtight wax seals, a rudimentary but incredibly effective cold storage gene bank. If a tree in the orchard died, or if a family ever came looking for their lost heritage, Opal had a backup ready to graft. June moved the flashlight beam to the center of the room. On a small wooden desk lay a thick leather ledger. She opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Opal's. It was a scientific ledger, organized into strict columns. Family name, date of graft, original tree variety, reason for loss. June traced the columns with her trembling finger. Hayes, 1992, Arkansas black, bank foreclosure. Miller, 1988, Virginia beauty, medical bankruptcy. Caldwell, 1995, wine sap, eminent domain fraud. Page after page of tragedies, 44 families who had been stripped of their land, their homes, and their legacies by banks, illness, and predatory developers. 44 times Opal Whitfield had quietly driven to a dying farm, taken a cutting of a heritage tree, and preserved it here. She was a woman keeping a museum of stolen things. June flipped to the last page. She counted the entries. 44. But as she looked around the room, sweeping her flashlight over the shelves, she realized something was wrong. She counted the wax-sealed jars. 10, 20, 40, 44, 45. June stopped. She walked to the very back shelf. Sitting alone, completely separated from the others, was a 45th jar. It was sealed in dark red wax, unlike the yellow beeswax of the others. June picked it up. There was no label, no family name. She looked back at the ledger. 44 entries. 45 jars. Why was one kept completely off the books? June stared at the dark red wax in the beam of the flashlight. A chill crept over her skin. She suddenly realized that solving Opal's puzzle hadn't ended the mystery. It had only revealed a much older, much deeper one. And whatever was inside this unlabeled jar, Roy must never, ever find out about it. To keep that secret safe, she had to keep the orchard. But Roy's lawsuit wasn't just a threat, it was a suffocating blanket. June stood in the cramped phone booth outside the motor court, listening to Denny's voice on the line. "He's claiming commingled assets, June," the lawyer explained, his tone tight. "He's arguing that since he paid your mother's medical bills, he subsidized the estate. To beat this, we have to prove the origin of Opal's funds. We need a paper trail showing she bought this land 40 years ago independently. I can hire a paralegal to dig through the county archives. It runs about $150 an hour." June closed her eyes. She thought about her bank account. She thought about the $26 to her name. "Don't hire anyone," she said. "I'll do it myself." She left the red wax jar sitting on its shelf in Unit 6 and drove Earl's truck down the mountain. The records room in the basement of the county courthouse smelled of old dust and decaying binding glue. For 6 hours, June wrestled with heavy leather-bound property ledgers and humming microfilm machines. She confirmed Opal had bought the land 40 years ago, but the financial trail was maddeningly vague. By hour 7, her eyes were burning. The rhythmic, mechanical whir-clack of the microfilm reel blurred into white noise. June slumped forward, resting her forehead against the cold metal casing of the machine. Her exhaustion pulled her under. In the heavy, disorienting space between wakefulness and sleep, a voice echoed in her mind, her distant cousin's voice over the crackling phone line. "Your great-grandmother had an orchard. The bank took it when things got bad." Bang! June flinched, her eyes snapping open, her heart hammering against her ribs. A clerk had just dropped a massive stack of tax volumes onto a nearby wooden table. June sat up, gasping slightly. She rubbed her face. The dream clung to her. The bank took it. She grabbed the microfilm dial. She stopped searching for Opal Whitfield. Instead, she searched 2 counties over. She searched for her great-grandmother's maiden name, Evelyn Hayes. It took another hour, and then a grainy black-and-white foreclosure document from October 1958 slid onto the illuminated screen. Property seized by First National Bank. Total acreage, 12. Assets liquidated at auction. June leaned in, tracking her finger down the itemized inventory of seized assets. 2 tractors, a farmhouse, a barn, and then, at the very bottom of the page, a single line made the blood drain from her face. Agricultural assets, 44 grafted apple trees. June stared at the glowing screen. The buzzing of the lights faded into total silence. 44 trees. She thought about the heavy leather ledger sitting on the desk back in Unit 6. Page after page of tragedies. 44 families saved by Opal. 44 names on the brass tags in the orchard. Opal hadn't just planted trees at random. She had built a 1-to-1 scale model of a ghost. Every time a bank or a developer crushed a family, Opal took a cutting and planted it here, filling the exact void left behind by her own mother's ruin. June stood up abruptly. She paid the clerk $3.25 to get a certified photocopy of the document. The paper was still warm from the machine when she took it, but her hands were freezing. As she walked out to the truck, her mind raced. The logic was clicking together piece by piece. 44 trees lost, 44 families saved.
The orchard was a memorial for strangers. But wait, June stopped with her hand on the truck door.
If the 44 trees in the orchard belonged to the strangers, where was Opal's tree? Where was the root of the 1958 orchard, the original legacy? The image of Unit 6 flashed in her mind. 10, 20, 44 yellow jars. And the 45th jar, the one kept completely off the books. June didn't just drive up the mountain, she practically flew. She left the truck idling in the gravel lot, sprinting past Rosie, and unlocked the heavy deadbolt of Unit 6. She walked past the shelves of yellow jars and went straight to the back corner. She picked up the 45th jar. It wasn't clear glass like the others. It was a dark, opaque amber apothecary bottle, impossible to see through. The top was sealed with a thick, heavy layer of dark red wax. No label, no family name, because Opal didn't need to write down her own grief. June took the grafting knife from her pocket. Her hands were shaking. She dug the sharp blade into the red wax, chipping away 40 years of silence. The seal cracked and broke apart, falling in dry red chunks onto the floor. June popped the glass lid. She reached inside, pulling out a bed of dry moss. Hidden within the moss was a single dormant scion twig. And tightly wrapped around the twig, bound by a piece of brittle cotton thread, was a small folded square of parchment. June carefully untied the thread and unrolled the paper. It wasn't a letter addressed to an heir. It was a journal entry, a vow, written in faded ink. October 14th, 1958. They took the farm today. I am 20 years old. They locked the gates and told us we had 1 hour. My mother wept on the porch. The men in the suits didn't even look at her. As we packed the truck, a seasonal farmhand came up to me. I didn't even know his last name. He slipped a damp rag into my coat pocket. He told me he had taken a cutting from my mother's favorite tree right before the bank chained the orchard shut. He said they could take the land, but they couldn't take the roots. I don't know his name. I can never thank him, but I swear to God, when I save enough to buy my own dirt, this branch will be the first thing planted, and I will pay this debt forward to everyone else who faces the men in suits. June lowered the paper. The air in Unit 6 was freezing, but hot tears spilled over her eyelashes, cutting warm tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. She looked at the dormant, sleeping twig in her hand. It was the original cutting, the survivor from 1958, her great-grandmother's tree. Opal had saved it. She had built this entire sanctuary from a single act of anonymous kindness. And now, decades later, Roy was trying to tear it all down. He had manipulated June while she was drowning in the grief of her mother's death, using the exact same predatory cruelty as the men in suits who had taken the original farm. History was trying to repeat itself. June wiped her face with the back of her hand. The sadness evaporated, leaving behind a core of pure, unbreakable steel. She looked at the leather ledger. She looked at the warm, certified photocopy of the 1958 foreclosure. She looked at Opal's vow. Roy wanted to claim he subsidized this estate? He wanted to drag her into a courtroom? June carefully placed the amber jar and the parchment into her duffel bag. She was going to court, and she was going to burn his arrogant, fabricated world to the ground. The courtroom smelled of floor polish and stale air. It was a stark contrast to the scent of pine and damp earth June had grown used to. She sat at the defendant's table. Arthur Denny sat beside her, acting only as the legal representative for the trust. but the heavy leather ledger and the certified 1958 foreclosure document rested entirely under June's hands. Across the aisle, Roy looked perfectly in his element. Charcoal suit, gold watch. He sat with the relaxed posture of a man who had already won. The judge, a tired-looking woman with graying hair, called the hearing to order. Roy's attorney stood up. He was slick, practiced. He painted a picture of a devoted stepfather who had poured his own financial resources into his dying wife's care, indirectly subsidizing the Whitfield estate. He argued that the property was heavily commingled with marital assets and should be liquidated to settle the debt. The respondent, the lawyer concluded, pointing a pen at June, was a grieving dependent. My client acted as her legal guardian, protecting her from the burden of a worthless, dilapidated property by having her sign a standard renunciation. The judge looked over her glasses at June. "Does the defense have a rebuttal?" June stood up. Her hands didn't shake. "My stepfather didn't subsidize this estate, Your Honor," June said, her voice clear and flat. She walked forward and placed the certified 1958 foreclosure document on the judge's bench. 40 years ago, Opal Whitfield bought that land entirely with her own money. She built a closed genetic archive. That ledger documents the preservation of 44 heritage trees rescued from 44 bankrupt families over 40 decades. It is a self-sustaining agricultural sanctuary. Not $1 of my stepfather's money ever touched that soil. The assets were never commingled. They were hidden. The judge opened the ledger. She read the columns. Her eyes lingered on Opal's faded handwritten vow from 1958, tucked inside the front cover. The courtroom went entirely silent. Roy shifted in his chair. The relaxed posture vanished. He leaned forward, his face flushing with sudden, uncontrolled heat. "That's irrelevant," Roy snapped, ignoring his attorney's warning hand. "You signed the property away. I was her legal guardian during that transition. I made the responsible choice for her." June turned to look him directly. This was it. The moment she had wanted since the day she locked her out. The moment she had promised to burn his fabricated world to the ground. "You keep using that word," June said softly. She picked up the copy of the renunciation paper from the table, the one with her rushed, messy signature at the bottom. "My mother died on a Tuesday," the words echoed in the quiet room. 9 days later, you slid this paper across the kitchen table. You told me it was just a formality to stop the lawyers from billing us." Roy's jaw tightened. "You were a dependent. I protected you." "I was 18, June fired back, her voice cutting through the room like glass. "That 9th day was the exact morning of my 18th birthday. My legal guardianship expired at midnight the night before. You waited for the clock to run out, so my signature would be legally binding, but you used my grief to make sure I didn't read it." She dropped the paper onto the table. "You weren't my guardian, Roy. You were just a man taking advantage of a teenager whose mother hadn't been in the ground for 2 weeks." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge looked from the paper to the ledger and finally to Roy. Disgust flashed briefly in her eyes before she schooled her features back to professional neutrality. "Motion denied," the judge said, striking her gavel. "Case dismissed." Roy didn't look remorseful. He erupted. "You ungrateful little brat! I fed you for 12 years and you steal this from me? You think you're so noble? When the bank foreclosed on my father's farm at Oakhaven in 1981, did anyone come to save us? No. I had to claw my way up from nothing. I earned everything I have." He stormed out of the courtroom, leaving an echoing silence behind him. June stood frozen at the defendant's table. Oakhaven, 1981. She opened the heavy leather ledger still sitting in front of her. Her fingers flew past the pages, tracing down the columns. 1992, 1988, 1981. She stopped. Family name, Vance. Original tree, Honeycrisp. Reason for loss, farm foreclosed at Oakhaven. June stared at the faded ink. Her breath left her. Opal hadn't had the money to save Roy's father's farm in 1981, but Opal knew what his father had spent his entire life breeding and building. She had quietly taken a cutting, brought it back, and spent 40 years protecting the soul and sweat of his father's labor. Roy had spent his entire life ruthlessly chasing money because he believed he had been abandoned. He thought no one cared. But the truth was, his family's most precious legacy had always been nurtured and sheltered by the exact same people he had just tried to destroy. June looked at the courtroom doors. She didn't feel anger anymore. She felt an overwhelming, profound pity. She closed the ledger. She knew exactly what her first act as the owner of Opal's orchard would be. 2 days later, a small, carefully wrapped package arrived at Roy's gated house. Inside was a single dormant apple scion, its cut end sealed in green grafting wax. Wrapped around it was a piece of paper, written in June's handwriting. "Your father's farm, Oakhaven, 1981. You thought no one came to help you. You were wrong. Opal saved this for him. It belongs to you." There was no anger in the note, no insult, no demand for an apology. June had simply returned what was his, breaking the cycle of cruelty that Roy had spent his life building. Back at the orchard, the late afternoon sun was turning the sky the color of a bruised peach. June walked out to the edge of the property, carrying a shovel and the dark amber apothecary jar. Earl was already waiting under the nameless tree. So was Rosie. "I finally found Opal's notes on the mule," Earl said quietly, handing June a weathered slip of paper. "It wasn't a vigil, it was maintenance." June read the note. "Keep the mule standing over the corner plot. Pack the dirt down hard. Make sure no one digs there by accident. Protect the soil until the rightful hands come to break it." Rosie hadn't been mourning. She had been protecting the exact spot where the heart of the orchard was meant to go. June patted the old mule's neck. Then she took the shovel and broke the hard, packed earth. She dug a small, precise hole. She opened the amber jar and took out the dry, dormant twig, the survivor from her great-grandmother's farm in 1958. She didn't graft it onto a borrowed root this time. She planted it directly into the earth. It was finally home. June stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands. The cool mountain wind rustled through the leaves of the 44 grafted trees behind her, a choir of stolen histories that had finally found peace. People can take your house. They can use your weakest moments to strip away everything you own, but they can never touch your roots unless you let them. The deepest cuts in our lives aren't meant to kill us. Like a grafted branch, they open a wound so we can bind ourselves to a new foundation. We borrow new legs to stand on. We heal, and from that scar, we grow the most original, unbroken fruit. June Calder didn't just inherit an orchard, she inherited a sanctuary. And tomorrow, there was work to do.